So you've heard that we're celebrating the Buddhist Parinirvana Day, and we will get there in the end. But you've also heard that I'm interested in the future. So we're going to start with the future. We're going to start with a film about the future. Blade Runner. How many of you have seen the original Blade Runner? Yes, quite a few. And how many saw the sequel, Blade Runner 2046? So set in the future, but very much pertinent to our own lives, I think. So my elder son, who's now doing filmmaking and was doing liberal arts, including a lot of film before, he wanted to watch the latest Blade Runner with me, which we did. The original is one of my favourite films. So he hadn't seen that. So having seen the new one, I showed him the old one. And I think we both agreed the original was better, as is often the case with sequels. But subsequently, I kind of thought about, well, why did I think that was? So my conclusion was that it's not really to do with the special effects. They're equally good on the new one. It's not to do with the acting, which I think was a bit better on the first one. The direction, the director was Ridley Scott for the first one, who's a really brilliant director. But I don't think it was those things. I think what it was that the original Blade Runner was actually taken from a science fiction book by a very brilliant writer called Philip K. Dick. And the book was called, if I'm right, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? So no wonder they changed the title to Blade Runner. But to jog your memory about the original, so to me the sequel is in a way pointless. It's about Hollywood and making money and putting on a spectacle. But the original, at its core, has got something which is mythic, which is meaningful. And I think that's really why it's a great movie. And the premise of the original is that as human beings have developed, they have cloned creatures that look like humans, are at least as intelligent as humans, are stronger than humans, but they're sort of enslaved. So they're used to colonize other planets, and they do the bidding of their human masters. But because the humans who invented them, produced them, were afraid that they might eventually rebel, they were given a limited lifespan. So 6 of these replicants, as they're called in the movie, come back to Earth because they know that their life is limited, but they don't know how long they've got. And they want to find out, and if possible, they want to extend their lifespan. So I think that's amazing, because that is really the position we're all in. We've got a limited amount of time. We don't know how long it is, and we'd like it to be as long as possible. And I think that mythic core of the movie is what drives it, what makes it deeper than just a spectacle. And essentially, what it's about is life and death. So you can't get more basic than that. And for those of you who've seen it, I'm sure you will remember it's not quite the end, but it's definitely the peak of the movie, where the baddie, the head of these replicants, as they're called, has been chasing the hero, seemingly with the intent to kill him. But they both end up on a rooftop, and the baddie is right at the point where his lifespan has come to an end. And instead of killing the hero, he saves him. He stops him from falling off the high building. And he finishes his life by reflecting on moments of awareness. He says, I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. And he mentions a couple of those things that out in the outer limits of the solar system, he's experienced these amazing sights. And they're obviously very meaningful to him. In other words, he's developed self-awareness. He's not only aware of things, but he's aware that he has seen those things and that he is about to die. And he says, and it's pouring with rain, he says very memorably, all those moments will be lost in time, like tears in the rain. And then there's a pause, and he says, time to die. And that's the end of his life. So it's very focused. The whole movie, in a way, this is the culmination of it. It's very focused on this kind of juxtaposition between life and death. And that's us existentially. You know, we've got all the other things. We've got our phones, we've got our partners, you know, we've got our jobs, whatever it is. We've got our distractions, we've got our hobbies. But at the core of our lives is this contrast of life and death. So that's what I want to explore first, our existential situation. Then we can come to the Buddha. So that's why it's death and the Buddha. So my way of exploring it is going to be a little personal. So my eye is better now, but last Sunday I had a really bad eye infection. I had a sty that had come up, it was horrible to look at, and my whole eye was swollen and there was a sort of red wheal around the eye. And it was a Sunday and I live on my own. And I thought, wow, this is getting worse. And the doctor's not open. It's quite a long way to the hospital. I'd have to walk there. It's night time on a Sunday. And in any case, you know, they're going to look at this and if it is something serious, I'll be there for 8 hours and it'll just get worse and worse. And I thought, what worried me was that if an infection transfers into the bloodstream, you get septicemia, which is what our teacher Sangharakshita had died of. And I'd had a really serious boil about 30, 40 years ago, which was operated on in hospital very quickly because they said if we don't, you could get septicemia. So I wouldn't say I was worried, but I was aware that there was at least a possibility that this could be something more serious than just an annoying, painful eye infection. And I was on my own. So I did what I could. I thought, okay, what you need is a good night's sleep. That's important. Go to bed. Don't worry about it. But you might not wake up in the morning. Or if you did, it might be too late. When Sangharakshita had septicemia, they took him to the doctors. But by the time they got there, they said, no, it's too late. There's nothing. I mean, admittedly, he was a bit older than I am. But they said, no, there's nothing we can do now. You just have to prepare yourself for death. And I did think on that Sunday, well, that'll be ironic. I won't be able to give the talk at the North London Buddhist Centre about death because I'll be dead. But that's the way death is. It's always a possibility. We just don't know. And most of the time it doesn't happen. I'm sure we've all had a few near scrapes. We've all had either an illness or an accident that could have been worse, something that could have happened, or if it wasn't for modern medicine, or if I hadn't, you know, done this rather than that. So there's always that possibility. And we don't know any more than those replicants did when death is going to come. So it's a very strange thing. because we know it will come, but at the same time, it often seems quite distant. Seems like something we don't have to think about today. But then you don't know. If you don't think about it now, well, it might come and it might be too late to think about it then. So we're thinking about it in this talk. So it's inevitable. Now, that's not necessarily a terrible thing. My dad died about 2.5 years ago, but I didn't really grieve his passing because he was 96. He'd led a very full life, a very positive life, and he was lucky. He didn't have any really serious illness in his old age. He'd had a cancer scare, but he'd had an operation that had cleared it up. It didn't recur. So in his old age, he just quietly got a bit more tired. He was still all there mentally, fortunately. He slowed down a bit more and more every time I saw him. And then it was COVID, so I didn't see him. He was out in Africa. But suddenly I got a call from my mum, "Your dad's gone." Only the day before, I had rung them. I talked to my mum, and she said, "Oh, let me get your dad." And then she came back and she said, "Oh, he's watching his favourite TV programme. You can talk to him next time." He had a bit of diarrhea, the sort of thing any of us might have and not think about. But because of his age, somehow, that was the final thing, like it was in the case of the Buddha, actually. And he felt tired, he went to bed, and then he called my mum and he just faded away. So it was a good death, but it is inevitable, isn't it? Even if you live long, even if you live well, sooner or later, it will come. Death will come to everybody. It's part of life. But then there's the whole question of what happens when we die. I mean, that's something else we'd like to know, isn't it? You know, okay, maybe we've kind of accepted that the end will come, but we'd really like to know what happens next. So as far as I can see, you know, there's really 3 main possibilities according to different traditions of humankind. So one is that when we die, we go to some kind of permanent death realm. So, you know, for the Vikings, this was Valhalla. For the ancient Greeks, it was Hades. And still today, for Christians or for Muslims, it's either heaven or hell. And once you're there in any of those places, people believed that that was it. That's where you stayed for all eternity. Seems unlikely, though. Why does it seem unlikely? It seems unlikely because it's so different from everything else we know. I mean, we don't know of anything else which is permanent. I mean, we know of things which continue for a long time, but that we don't know of anything that's permanent. I don't know if any of you have watched this, so you can see I like my media. I'm into photography, but also film, and in this case, it's a sitcom. There's a comedy, a BBC comedy, about 2 parents and their 3 kids, and the middle child has the most sort of fantastic imagination, a really quite wild imagination. And there's one point in a very funny scene where he's talking to a vicar at a wedding, and he's bringing up all kinds of things. And he says, "Why has God made it that in 50 billion years' time, the sun is going to come to an end and we're all going to die?" And of course, you know, it's fantastical, because who would think that far ahead and worry about what's going to happen in 50 million, or was it 50 billion years' time? But, you know, that's it. I mean, even with the bigger things, never mind our lives, even with the sun, it's not a permanent feature. it will not always be there. So it does seem rather unlikely that there's anything that goes against everything that we experience on every level during the course of our lives. Not that it's impossible, but there you go. Then there's the idea that when we die, we are just permanently annihilated. Just in the same way that our body will come to an end and can be cremated until there's just a handful of ash, many people believe that who we are, our personality, our minds, will just come to an end. And not everybody thinks of that entirely negatively. My own father believed that. He was an atheist. He believed that when he died, that would be it, from his point of view. But he felt that life was worth living because you contributed to humanity. You left a legacy behind if you did good work, important things that in some way moved society on, which he felt he was trying to do. But that's another possibility, that when death comes, that's it. There's nothing left over. Again, it's another kind of permanence, though, isn't it? And it doesn't seem to replicate what we see in life, that generally in some way or another, there is some continuity. Yes, the plant dies, but the seed grows again. So in Buddhism, we have the idea of cyclical rebirth. It's rather different from reincarnation. In a way, reincarnation is more like the idea of a permanent realm, except that realm is inside you. So reincarnation is the idea that there's something permanently you, which takes up different bodies, but that there's a permanence about the soul, or whatever you want to call it. But in Buddhism, there's this idea that, well, it's not really one or the other. You don't carry on as you are, but you don't come to a grinding halt. According to how you've been in this life, something continues and affects a birth in another life. But then there is really a fourth possibility, which we don't usually consider, mainly because it doesn't currently apply to us. And that's what happens to a Buddha when a Buddha dies. What happens to an enlightened being when they die? Now, the Buddha was asked this question a number of times. And it seemed to be something that created quite a puzzle, because he was asked, does a Buddha still exist after death? Or does a Buddha not exist after death? Or does a Buddha both exist and not exist? Or does a Buddha neither exist nor not exist? So they're sort of covering all the possible bases of sort of logical thought, or even illogical thought. But according to the Buddha, this was one of the great unanswered questions. It's not completely clear whether it's unanswerable or whether the Buddha just wouldn't answer it. So there's a sutta, Pali Sutta, one of these early discourses that has been preserved, called the Kulamitra Vada Sutta, where a character called Malunkhya, he's a monk, he's practicing under the Buddha, but he's on solitary retreat, he's on his own and he's meditating, and he realizes that he feels quite aggrieved that the Buddha won't answer these unanswered questions. So there's a kind of standard list of them. So it's, is the cosmos finite or infinite? Is the universe eternal or not? Is what the Indian tradition called the jiva. It's sometimes translated as soul, but it's really like the life force, the life principle. Is the life principle the same as the body, or is it different? And all these questions had already been asked to the Buddha, and he'd not answered them. So Malunkhya goes to the Buddha and he says, look, if you'll answer these questions, I'll practice your teaching. But if not, I'm not going to practice with you. And the Buddha says, well, whether you want to practice with me or not, you'll find I'm not going to answer any of those questions. And he says, when you started practice with me, did I say to you, did I promise you that I would answer any of those questions? And the monk admits that he didn't promise that. And he said, no, I didn't promise you that. And that's not what this practice is about. This practice is about you in the here and now. All those things are views, and those views don't help you to change and transform yourself. It doesn't matter in a way what the answer is. It's a kind of abstract concept. It really doesn't help you now. He says, whether the universe is eternal or not, you're still going to suffer until you've overcome suffering. There's still going to be old age, sickness, and death, even if you knew the answer to those questions. And what I've said is I can help you deal with old age, sickness, and death. I can help you transform yourself until enlightenment. So Malunkhya is reassured, he's re-inspired, and he carries on with his practice. But in the course of his answer, the Buddha uses what's become a very famous simile. He says, look, it's as if someone shot a poisoned arrow at you. So the Buddha came from a warrior background. He was well aware of, warfare, even though he was not part of it. It was all around in India. He said, it's as if someone shot a poisoned arrow at you, and when the surgeon came to pull it out as quickly as possible, you said, hang on a minute, I want to know who shot the arrow. I want to know their social status. Was it a Brahmin? Was it a warrior? Was it an untouchable? I need to know. And anyway, what's the wood made of? I want to know, is it this wood? Is it that wood? What about the feathers? What bird have the feathers come from? And what kind of poison is it anyway? And the Buddha said, by the time you had the answer to those questions, you'd be dead. So he says it's the same with these unanswered questions. If you just puzzle over those, in a way, you're just going to waste your time. You're going to waste your life. You won't come to any conclusions anyway. And the opportunity for practice will have passed. So let's now come to the Buddha as he approached his death. So there's one text in particular called the Parinirvana Sutta, the Mahaparinirvana Sutta, the great sutta of the Parinirvana, where it starts a few months before the Buddha's death. And the Buddha knows a few months beforehand that he's going to die. In fact, the way the sutta describes it, he gives up his life principle. So he sort of, he's an old man, he's in his 80s, but he decides, this is it, I'm just going to have a few more months. I need a little bit of time to go around and see all my disciples, and then I'm going to die. And as he goes around from place to place, everywhere he goes, according to this sutta, he teaches the threefold way. So the threefold way is the most simple communication of the Buddhist path to enlightenment. So it's sila, which is ethical training, samadhi, which is meditation practice, and prajna, which is wisdom, insight. And everywhere he goes, this is what the Buddha does. He goes over it one more time. And it's not really different from what he's been doing every day since his enlightenment. He wanders around India, he talks to people, he tells them, if they're open to it, what the path to enlightenment is. And it's all the different versions can come in under that threefold heading. You can split up each one of the three into different sections, and you can discuss those in great detail. But the shorthand is he's talking about the path. Everywhere he goes, he's trying to help people lead a spiritual life, gain enlightenment, and overcome their own suffering. So I think that's quite interesting, that even though the sutta describes the Buddha as knowing that he's going to die quite soon, it doesn't really change anything for the Buddha. He sort of carries on. Maybe there's a sense of him redoubling his efforts, but it's not as if he's been exactly idle for the last 45 years. So I think that's interesting. But I think, coming back to these unanswered questions, yes, the sutta says that the Buddha doesn't answer them because they're not helpful. That's one reason. But I think there's a sort of deeper reason as well. There are some questions that are unanswerable because we have constructed a question that can't be answered. It doesn't really work. And despite all our technological development, despite the progress made by science, I think there are certain things that we absolutely don't understand at all. So we don't understand life and death. No one has been able to tell us from a sort of scientific, rational point of view what happens after death. I mean, there's a certain amount of evidence about what happens during the death process. You know, the body cools from the limbs, the externals, and so on. There's some suggestion even that consciousness might be present in some form for a little while after you stop breathing, etc. But no, we don't know. We don't know what death is. We just see it happen. But that's not surprising because we don't know what life is. Despite all our scientific knowledge about nature, I don't think it's ever been explained how the crucial transitions took place. So the crucial transition between inorganic matter becoming an organic process. I don't think there is. I mean, it's observable. People can try and go back into the past and say, it probably happened here, it probably happened in this way. But that isn't the same thing as explaining why it happened or what actually happened. And I don't think it's been explained how that organic process that started with plants jumped into all sorts of creatures that can move around. I mean, despite our understanding of evolution, we can plot some of that development, but we don't really understand what happened, why it happened, how it happened. And we certainly don't understand how consciousness developed from that, self-awareness. You know, we see some rudimentary self-awareness in some of what we call the higher animals, okay? So primates, dolphins, maybe dogs, cats. We see a rudiment. But even then, where did that rudiment come from? These transition points are not understood. We don't know. It's a mystery. Nor, at a higher level, do we understand at all the Buddha's awakening. We talk about it. We talk about the Buddha gaining enlightenment. Maybe, we've heard these teachings that, well, if you practice ethical behavior and transform yourself in that way and calm down and then practice meditation, one day something will happen and boom, you're enlightened. But what? What is it that's happened? How did that happen? Why doesn't it happen more generally? We don't know. The only way to know is to practice the path and have it happen to us. But what it is that happens at that point, we don't really know. What people saw with the Buddha was they saw someone very positive. They saw someone very kind. They saw someone very wise. And naturally, they were inspired. They wanted to be more like that. I was talking earlier on, I was asked, how did I get involved in Buddhism? And I wanted to learn meditation, but to be honest, my idea was that I would learn meditation, I would go off on my own. I didn't want to join a group. But when I came along to a Buddhist centre, and when I saw the order members, who were just a few years older than me, and how they were, and how they interacted with each other, it wasn't that they knew everything, but they were doing something that was inspiring. And they had clearly begun to change themselves in a way that I could appreciate. So that was it. That's what I saw. And it's like, yes, I want some of that. I would like to be like that. When I'm a few years older, I would like to be like that. So you see that from the outside, but you don't know with the Buddha what his inner experience is. And because we don't understand his awakening, we don't understand his death. We don't understand what happens to a Buddha when he dies. We try and think of it. Oh, does he still exist when his body's gone? Maybe he doesn't exist. And then the Indians, being clever clogs, thought, well, maybe he exists, but he doesn't exist. Or maybe it's neither existence or non-existence, whatever that means. But we're trying to apply categories that no longer apply. Again, in the early Buddhist tradition, there's some lovely similes. They're very poetic, but you can easily pass them by. And one of them is that the enlightened person is like birds in the sky. You can no longer track them. You can no longer see everything about them, where they go. They're flying high, but they move in their own way. You can't predict an enlightened person's behavior. And there's something of this in the Parinirvana Sutta about the Parinirvana itself. So in the moment that the Buddha decides, which is the way the sutta puts it, that he is going to give up his life, he's going to, in 3 months' time, pass away, the whole world quakes. So it's like an enormous earthquake. And we're told that this happens when a Buddha is born, it happens when he's enlightened, it happens when he first teaches, and it happens when he dies. But there's a sort of response, even to his intention to pass away, that's on a cosmic level, if you like. And then the other thing that's interesting in the sutta, the Mahaparinirvana Sutta, is when the Buddha comes to his last resting place. By that time he's not very well, he's elderly, he's had a meal which has given him diarrhea, and he's sort of struggled even to get to this place. And he asks his cousin, who's his attendant, to prepare a seat between two trees, and he lies down on the robe that's been spread out between the trees, and they spring into blossom unseasonably. So it's not the time of year, there's just a few things coming into blossom now, but it's as if something came into blossom, months before it was supposed to happen. So it's a kind of minor miracle, if you like. But again, it's an indication in the sutta that there's something going on which is on a bigger level, on a wider level. It's not just about the Buddha and his disciples. There's something about the whole cosmos, the whole universe. This is an important moment in life. And I think that's why, again, in the sutta, it's portrayed that there are different responses to the Buddha's death. Some people are grief-stricken. For instance, this cousin Ananda, he's known the Buddha all his life, but he's been his companion in the monastic life for a long time, is absolutely grief-struck. He can't bear the thought that his friend and teacher is going to be no more. He won't have any access to him. And there are many of the monk disciples who are in that sort of state. They're grief-stricken. Some of the lay people are like that. But there's other people who are quite calm, not because they're disconnected from the Buddha, but it's almost as if they're enjoying it. Not that they're kind of gleefully happy the Buddha's going to be no more, but they're present with this cosmically significant moment. They're able to stay present and experience it in that way. So it's not just about them. I won't have access to the Buddha anymore. They're the Buddha's enlightened disciples, and they're able to sort of participate in the meaning, whatever it is, that we don't quite get about the Buddha's enlightenment and his enlightened death for the whole universe. It's a kind of, seems to be considered a significant moment. And it's very difficult to say why that is, because we don't understand enlightenment. We don't understand the place of enlightenment. We can see it from outside. We can see, well, that'd be nice. I'd quite like that. I wouldn't worry about anything anymore. I wouldn't be unhappy anymore. But we don't understand what happens internally within someone, the transformation that takes place. And we can only see it in the terms that we do understand. So we see the spiritual life largely as psychological. We understand that we have an awareness of ourselves, that we can do something about that, and that's fantastic. That is part of the threefold way that the Buddha is telling people to practice, to be aware of yourself, to understand yourself, and to start to work with what you find. But I don't think that's the whole story. I think when you come out the other side of your own, I was going to say petty concerns, but they're not petty to us, of our own genuine concerns, let's say, when you've grown beyond those, something new unfolds. You step into another dimension, and we don't know what that is. And that's the dimension the Buddha was in when he died. And somehow that dimension kind of resonates, is significant, and, as it were, affects, at least according to the tradition, according to the sutta, the whole world in ways that we find difficult to understand. You know, it's not considered that the earthquake is a coincidence. You know, there have been people. I saw something recently. You know, astronomers trying to go back to the time they think Jesus Christ was born and work out why the wise men saw a star in the sky that pointed to Bethlehem, because this was in conjunction with that, and there was a particularly bright something or other, and so on. But it's not as if Buddhism is trying to say, you know, oh, look, you know, Krakatoa went up at the time the Buddha died. No, it's supposedly the effect of his death. Something happens, it sends ripples, it sends waves in a way that we don't quite understand. And the reason we don't understand it is because we don't understand our own life. We don't understand our own death. And the only way to find out is not to go and ask someone all these kind of theoretical questions. The way to find out is to practice the Dharma, to transform ourselves. And that is what I will leave you with.